we need to stop thinking about our homes as a lottery ticket, but yet also recognize that our homes are a financial asset.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
A huge thanks. We're super proud to partner with Saul Ewing to bring you these smart conversations. Please, if you have an idea for a guest or show or have an interest in sponsoring as well, email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
And if you like the show, we're told that leaving a review and spreading the word is the best thing that you can do to help us make more of these shows.
I want to also give a quick special thanks to our producer and director. We have Max, who's our producer, who's amazing, does all these great things for the episode. Caroline Cooper, who has done a great job as our director. So we don't often give them a shout out. I thought at the top of this episode, we would recognize them and actually tell you guys we have a director and producer. So we do need sponsors and others to help us out and continue paying them for their amazing work. Excited about today's episode, sort of continuation of what we talked about with Ivan on building codes. Our guest today is Mike Kingsella. Mike is the founder and CEO of Up for Growth, a Washington, D.C. based organization. They're dedicated to achieving housing equity, eliminating barriers, and creating more homes across the United States.
That's right, John. I mean, I can't think of a better conversation for Housing Insiders than talking about their research, their advocacy. You know, in 2024, Up for Growth put out the number of the shortage we're looking at for this country's housing crisis. And, you know, Mike's research found that we're short 3.85 million homes in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. So we're going to talk a lot about what to do about that and who can help, especially, you know, in DC. So welcome to the show, Mike, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
So one of the things I wanted to kick us off with was an understanding if somebody's listening to this and like, you know, you were saying earlier, they're into housing, they're in the weeds, they're a housing nerd like the rest of us, but for some reason they haven't heard of Up for Growth. Maybe you could just start with that. Talk to us about founding this organization and, you know, where you are today.
My story really is the story of someone who grew up in Portland, Oregon, deeply interested in the way that cities come together, right? And that cities develop and how cities can either benefit communities or, unfortunately, for far too many, the challenges of operating in a city can really, you know, seek to impede the ability to get on that economic ladder and really take full advantage of opportunities. And so, you know, growing up in that context, I got to see firsthand the development of Portland, Oregon's Pearl District, the South Waterfront District, both amazing master plan, new urbanist, urban regeneration efforts that, you know, were just, you know, incredibly compelling to see as a young person, and ended up studying community development and urban planning at Portland State University. Go Vikings! And ultimately got into the residential, the commercial real estate space, working on housing. So I spent about 15 years on the practitioner side, working in public finance, working in debt and equity, working in asset management, working at a big four consulting firm, really working on all, you know, from all of these different vantage points, looking at the market, I'd say from 2003 through the global financial crisis of 07 and 08, staying employed. Luckily, I was one of the fortunate among my friends, and ultimately landing at a real estate development firm back in Portland, Oregon, where I, you know, got to engage on the policy side, specifically on policies like inclusionary housing and zoning reform. So, you know, that really led to the identification of a huge gap, which is, and again, this is 2016, 2017, there were no national organizations singularly focused on what I personally think is the most pressing challenge of our generation, which is a shortage of homes. So there are no organizations in DC laser focused on this issue. Sure, you know, there's groups like NMHC, the home builders, enterprise community partners, Habitat for Humanity, all sort of working on, you know, pieces of this issue, but really representing specific stakeholder groups, not the broader public interest. So after forming Oregon Smart Growth, which successfully advocated for streamlining development policies and processes, supporting and advocating for the statewide elimination of exclusionary zoning, sort of took a step back. That's been a lot of fun. It's been really impactful work. But to truly move the needle on this problem, we need to approach it from a national perspective because, as the report you mentioned proves, right, this is a national housing shortage. So to solve that, we need to operate nationally, and we need to build a big tent to bring all sorts of stakeholders together to align on this issue and really push for change.
I'm glad you mentioned that you have an urban planning background because of all the types of education I wish I had in my background, that's one that I envy the most. I'm actually just reading this book called Plans of Chicago. I randomly ran into the author in New York and he sent me a copy, and it's a really fascinating history of how Chicago is planned and developed. In the introduction, they kind of talk about this interesting conflict of cities that just kind of grow randomly, where it's sort of individuals are making individual choices and it sort of stochastically grows, versus a more like centrally planned city, which is not looking to optimize for the individuals, it's looking to optimize for the collective of the city. So anyway, it just had me thinking a lot about what's led us to this crisis. And have we just failed to plan appropriately for some form of growth? And I'm just kind of curious to get your opinion because, we'll talk a lot about zoning and sort of what reforms can happen there, but like we're trying to fix some underlying thing that got broken. And I'm just curious to get your view. What is it that broke that we're now trying to fix?
Great question, Jonathan. And I'm going to try to, be succinct here, but it's a complicated issue, right? I would say that neither approach is correct, right? We have seen, I think, for example, if you look at the UK, which is a highly centralized system of planning, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 passed Parliament immediately following World War II. There was a lot of effort around housing, returning soldiers and servicemen and women, just like we had here. And the approach in the UK was very much a centralized approach. It was social housing, council estates initially. It was regulating the approval of market rate housing production. And ultimately, when we look back with the benefit of 80 years of hindsight, what's transpired, that moment, that policy choice in the UK, centralized planning, project approvals at the discretion of the UK Secretary of State, that has resulted in a housing shortage in the UK that actually exceeds America's problem to the tune of about double when you look at the shortage relative to total housing stock in that nation. On the other hand, when you look at the United States, we have a very hyper-local system of project approvals. And we all know the parade of horribles that follow, right? When you show up at a city council, I can't tell you how many people that have told me that going to a city council hearing on a project radicalized them into becoming YIMBY, which is, I guess, good news for the YIMBY movement, bad news for housing production in the US. So what I would say is like planning isn't the issue here. And in fact, I think there's an argument to enable the planners to get back to planning. I would say the challenge really is the regulatory framework around discretion being core to our process. I would say the layers of policies that compound upon each other that make it awfully expensive and awfully time consuming to get units out of the ground, to get homes into the market. That's the real problem. So the way I would want to answer this is let's just conduct a thought experiment, right? Remember, look back to the 1970s, the 1980s, when you had organizations like Trammell Crow Residential just blowing through projects in Texas and really across the country, delivering garden-style market rate apartments at 70% of area median income. So if you made 70% of AMI, you could comfortably afford to rent a unit in the market. And compare that to today, where if you're apartment shopping, if you don't make something close to 120% or 130% of the average income for your region, there is no way you're going to be able to afford market rate rental without some sort of support help from mom and dad, right? Or maybe just coming out of pocket 40%, 50% of your gross paycheck going to the rent just to live in the neighborhood that you want to. And so I sort of describe this as the divergence of the real market for housing, the market between landlords, property owners, and tenants, and the financial market for housing between those that invest in the production and lend against the construction of new housing. And as those two markets have grown apart, it's really a consequence of layer upon layer of artificial barrier to production that has meant that in each cycle successive from the past, we're building over a shorter period of time and we're building fewer and fewer units, especially compared to the need for apartments and the need for homes that we face in America today.
Can we break down some of those layers? Because I'm really curious about if we are talking about jurisdictional layers. So local added theirs and then state or county added theirs and then state added theirs and then the federal added theirs, or is it more local continue to add local regulation? Can you talk a little bit, break down those layers for us, how much that is compounding?
I would say the whole ball game is at the local level. Now, the challenge is when all of these barriers are at a local level, left to the decision making and the discretion of just a handful of city council members who are often really beholden to very small groups of constituents. And again, a small sliver of those constituents can be quite loud and persistent and challenging, right? That results in the breakage of the political economy and the ability for those policymakers to apply local leadership. Now, of course, you do have mayors and city council members around the country who, for a long time have been very good on this issue. I just spoke to a mayor out in Utah who leads a community. It's actually a defense community. They have an Air Force base in their city. And the problem there is that servicemen and women are not able to afford market rate housing for all the same reasons, right, that we've been talking about. So instead of teachers and firefighters, conversation is you've got pilots and enlisted folks who just can't afford market rate housing, even with their military housing allowance. And so essentially, his position is, I know I'm going to take some hard votes, but at the end of the day, I've been elected to lead policy and to make the right choices for the benefit of the full community, not just those who elected me and not just those who are politically influential in the town. That's rare. And so our conclusion, and this is really building off the shoulders of people like Vicki Bean, former deputy mayor of New York City and huge thought leader associated with the Furman Center at NYU, we really build on her idea of, the political economy of City Hall is just broken. And so that leads one to want to engage on these big issues around housing at the state level. And I would argue the federal level. And so, because truly, as our report shows, housing shortage is not unique to California, New York, or just a couple of other states. It's national. There's not a state in the country that doesn't have a shortage. And so our view is a national problem demands federal leadership. So the field of play from a policymaking standpoint, we've seen over the past decade has now moved from City Hall to state capitals around the country and now Washington, D.C. And I believe that, that is where the action is as far as the opportunity to really make a difference. But ultimately, the purpose is to dismantle, to improve these regulatory frameworks on the ground where housing is ultimately built.
That's compelling. I want to maybe reframe what I said earlier, and I'm going to admit myself as a proud NIMBY, which I don't want you to not like me, but I want to articulate why I say that. What it sounds like to me is like at some point, the collective good is improved by diminishing my individual good. That's fine. However, we make our choices, and NIMBYs are often accused of two things. Number one is sort of just blatant racism. I don't want this type of person in my neighborhood. I'm certainly not that. Then they're secondarily blamed for just being greedy. Like, I'm making a ton of money on my home, and you're taking out my money away. And honestly, for me, and I think probably for many of the people that you're talking to, mayors, folks in Congress who probably come from decent backgrounds, probably own a home, probably a lot of what they think about is the quality of the lifestyle they live that they bought into when they bought their home, right? I picked the neighborhood I picked because of the characteristics of the neighborhood, available street parking, parks, lots of families, lots of spaces to walk. These are the types of reasons I picked the home I picked. Now, I have a home that's very close to the city center in Washington, D.C. There's no reason in God's green earth that somebody should have as spacious a space I have being so close to the center of a city in which I believe there's only 700,000 people in Washington, D.C., but during the day, there's 4 million people that flood into the city because it's where all the jobs are, right? There's no reason I, as an individual, should have been able to buy and have the expectation that I did, that I could keep my home the way I want to for as long as I do. But that's the situation. I bought a place. It was not cheap. It was a considerable amount of the money I made at the time I bought it, but I did it for my family. And anyway, in some ways, I want to protect that against what is probably best for the city of Washington, D.C., which is like all of these spacious areas that have very low density that are right near the city center should just basically be demolished in exchange for much higher density urban living. But again, that's sort of where I kind of come into this question of like my individual NIMBYism. I fully recognize is conflicting with the communal good. So anyway, it's not an argument that you're hearing for the first time. And I'm sure this is what you come up against all the time. I guess I'm wondering what you say to a Trump administration who has publicly said they want to protect the quality of suburban life, which again, maybe that's a veiled racist sort of Trump sort of talking point or something like that. But maybe it's just literally what every suburbanite in the country wants to hear, which is like, I want to maintain the sort of lifestyle I have. And it's not about the money. It's not about the race of my neighborhood. It's just about, I just don't want density where in my backyard. So anyway, sorry for that long-winded NIMBY argument, but I would love to hear how you respond to that.
Spot on, and that's a big part of the conversation. I want to maybe peel apart. I think there's a couple of pieces we can go back and forth on. There's one which is about your home that you bought, and there were certain conditions that existed when you bought your home, and you have a vested interest in maintaining that asset. And frankly, right, there's a very personal, like, we've all grown up being told the American dream is buying a home, the biggest asset in your life, right? Your biggest sort of like retirement vehicle is buying and owning a home. So that's one piece of the conversation. And then there's this other piece of the conversation, which really relates to all these people are moving into the DC area. All these people are moving into the Bay Area, and our rents are going up, but we don't want our community to change. We have to accept density, right? Which is an anathema for those who invested in a neighborhood based on certain quality of life appeals, right? Maybe you love that, large lot home that you've got in Northwest DC, and it's not about the money at all. But I bring this up to say, like, there are threads here that I think it's useful to pull this apart. On the first point around the financial aspect, right? We've got to stop. Jerusalem Dimsis at The Atlantic has done some really amazing reporting, of course, on housing. And one of her pieces really landed with me is like, the baby boomer generation experienced a historically significant increase in wealth and equity because of the moment in time that folks of that generation generally bought their home and what happened in the real estate markets thereafter. And her impact was, that's not going to happen again. And so I think, we wouldn't suggest that we design policy to objectively devalue homes. What we're talking about is policy to better align the rate of housing cost growth with wage growth, right? So in some sense, like, this is all about inflation. And what I would go further to say is that, yes, there needs to be a mindset shift in this country. We need to stop thinking about our homes as a lottery ticket, but yet also recognize that our homes are a financial asset. That's one piece, and I'm happy to unpack that as we continue our discussion. The second piece is, it's not a binary. No one's suggesting Northwest DC, skyscrapers everywhere. You're not going to become Manhattan for, certainly not my lifetime. And that's just an economic matter, right? But I do think that, there's a lot of fear of the unknown. And that's just human nature. And that goes back to the conversation about the role of state and federal government really weighing these trade-offs, right? Again, when you're in a city council meeting, it's about your block. It's about neighborhood politics. It's not about GDP. It's not about economic security. It's not about international competitiveness, right? And that's why we debate policy around education at the state level and the federal level. We provide local control to towns and cities across the country with regards to their school districts. But states still come in and say, here are the accreditation standards, here are the education requirements for faculty, here are the number of days you must be open. And so that I think is the mindset shift from a policy perspective to better calibrate these policies to the broad needs of society. But again, it's not one versus the other. This is a nuanced conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you bring up that's always been fascinating to me, and we dig into it a lot here on Housing Insiders, is the complexity of the problem, the complexity of what we're talking about. I'll kind of mention two things in the wake of this conversation. One is my friend, Mark Wallace, who is a listener of Housing Insiders, once posed a very fascinating, innovative question to me. He said, if you really want to change housing stock, why wouldn't you just invest in schools? Because they are a magnet, and then private industry will end up renovating all the housing stock around a school once it becomes an attractive school for people to go to. You want to change housing, make it an education problem. But I think one of the questions I have for you is, now you're taking two of the largest problems and complex areas in America and smashing them together to then talk about solutions. So how do you think about solutions, as you just mentioned, these complex, heavily layered issues in a community at the city council, for a mayor, for a governor, without overburdening the problem and having everybody go, it's just too complicated?
Well, right, Jeremy, when you try to solve all problems, you're not going to solve any problems, right? But I do think housing is tricky because it is so foundational to so much of our lives, to so much of our communities and our nation, right? Housing is at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a reason. And so, yes, this problem that we're facing, these problems that we're facing goes far beyond, the sticks and bricks of housing production and the basics of housing policy. I can talk about supply as long as the day is long, because that is my bread and butter. That is my focus as a professional running Up for Growth and in our advocacy. But, again, housing isn't just a supply problem. It's tied to income stagnation and rising costs overall. And we as a society have to tackle both sides. So I guess my answer to you, Jeremy, is we need to acknowledge that. Each of us change makers across the country working in our respective fields need to recognize that none of these problems exist in a silo. What I just want to, kind of lean in a little bit more on that point for both of you, and curious sort of how this lands with you, right? I think a lot about markets, economics and finance, very much my background. And one of the things that I think often gets lost in the conversation is this idea that, Austin, Texas builds a lot of homes, rents go down. That's filtering. That's not filtering, right? That is a shock, right, to the market, which is very temporal. It's the nature of our cyclical real estate market. Maybe this is a hot take, but just building more homes won't lower rents immediately, right? Which is why I think there could be a little bit of frustration on the part of, folks who are a little skeptical here about the supply agenda to say, well, Austin's been building all these homes. What about the folks at 30% of AMI? So I think that speaks to a bolder solution that is needed. And I know we're going to get to that, Jonathan, after the break. But, filtering, which is what we're really talking about, depreciation of housing as it ages, that's a long game, not an instant fix. And I think the trick is, given the nature of our market in the United States, as to how we rely nearly exclusively on the private sector to get housing built, consistent production is key to achieve filtering and broad-based affordability outcomes. But if we're reliant on the capital markets and our economic cycles, we're never going to build housing consistency. That's the reason for the divergence of the real and financial market for housing. So I'd love to get into that because I think that's a big part of this conversation. And I think by going there, you get to let's say, transcend some of these, seeming impasse at the neighborhood level.
I would love to get into. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you just said. What you're saying about Austin is that the immediate and quick building is something that's not the right way to do it. But the thing is, you've got to create a consistent and sustainable process of building. Anyway, can you say more about your point? Because I really want to make sure I fully understand it.
Let me put it this way, right? Austin has built a ton of housing over the past few years, and there's a variety of reasons, right? Capital really loves Austin, sort of one of these emergent 18-hour cities, right? Just like Nashville and a few other spots around the country. Investors are looking for a little bit more yield, right? They've also been doing some work at the policy level, like legalizing accessory dwelling units, reducing lot sizes. All of that accrues to increasing the feasibility of more and more middle homes, which is a really important piece of the solution. So I'm not saying any of that is bad. That's really great. That's good. We should celebrate that rents have objectively gone down in Austin. But the problem is this, right? So let's play this out, right? Investors today are saying, oh boy, Austin's overheated. Landlords, the developers, they're having to take concessions. I can go buy an existing apartment building in Austin for a fraction of the cost that it's going to take to build that same apartment in a new development. So guess what? Nothing happens. And nothing's going to happen for quite some time until the market rents get to a level that will then enable new development to pencil. And so for all of that time, the reason your rents are increasing to justify new development is because renters are paying more and more and more year over year. And so the consequence here is that when we start to get to a little bit more affordability, which is clearly our policy imperative, it's our objective with all of this, the market cools because the yields aren't there any longer. As affordability increases, your yields decrease. And so that's the trap. And I think that the answer isn't, oh, let's just socialize housing. But I do think that there's something to some of the novel financial instruments like Housing Opportunities Commission up in Montgomery County, Maryland, or some of the work that's being done in Denver, Colorado with the Middle Income Housing Authority. And so the challenge for us as sort of folks who understand the public benefit objective and understand the realities of how housing is built is how do we create an environment where we have consistent housing production year over year and wisely leveraging public sector investment to smooth that investment cycle, that we can ultimately attain that broad-based affordability that I think every community wants.
Jeremy, you want to share a quick word about our sponsor?
Today's sponsor is Saul Ewing. Consumer financial services companies face a constant onslaught of litigation and risk arising from a multitude of federal and state consumer protection laws. They also contend with enforcement actions from federal and state regulators and agencies. Navigating these obstacles while managing legal costs in today's crowded and shifting market presents unique challenges to these institutions. The attorneys at Saul Ewing's Consumer Financial Services litigation practice are sensitive to these challenges and provide their clients with practical, industry-specific advice and counsel. To learn more, go to saul.com under capabilities. Back to the show.
All right, so coming back with Mike Kingsella at Up for Growth, we've been talking a lot about sort of regulatory reform and the things that Up for Growth work on and hitting what I think is just a really important part of the conversation. Mike, I'm curious to get your thoughts because you've said a couple of times that this is sort of moving up from the local level to the state and the federal level. And I agree with you. And as much as, my earlier claim of being a proud NIMBY and wanting to protect my own sort of backyard, if you will, like I do recognize the fact that that is not sustainable for any city. And at some point, collective action needs to happen such that it guides private capital, guides development in a way that's just much friendlier for cities. So anyway, despite being a NIMBY, I want to be fought, but I want to be fought effectively by some central planning that is being thoughtful.
It sounds like you're like a NIMBY, maybe in my backyard.
Maybe.
No, definitely not. Somebody has to force me to have it in my backyard. But I guess is my point. But I'm okay with that,
And I think, Mike, I've heard you use the phrase housing as an economic engine. And I love that because I love the free markets and I love the competition and I love the public-private partnership that you just described, right? The best public funding is smoothing out, backstopping the sort of whiplash of the private market in industries where that exists, let's say. What is it that is, I guess I'll put it even more bluntly, why isn't it obvious to everyone that housing is an economic engine to the whole community? And so we do want it in our backyard. I want it in my backyard simply because that's more consumers for my small business partners. That's more opportunity for me to be an entrepreneur, to grow, and to have economic outcomes for my family as well. Why isn't it obvious to everyone that housing is an economic engine to communities and actually could provide more consumer and business opportunities for everybody in the community?
Obviously, we agree. It's a economic issue from the standpoint of business growth, workforce recruitment, retention, all the rest. It's an economic competitiveness issue when we can't attract the best and brightest to our country. It's our most productive labor markets, Silicon Valley, Research Triangle, et cetera. And so without housing, there is no economic growth, right? So that's a core message that I think a lot of people understand. I think the problem is, not a lot of people think about that in their day to day. And the dynamic that we have seen play out year over year, decade over decade, especially if you look to California, which is one of the greatest housing shortages within the US, is that conversation happens in a completely separate room. So I think these points that you're raising explain the rise of the YIMBY movement writ large. It explains the rise of, I think, what some are calling the abundance movement, with Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's recent book. Also a great complement to that, by the way, is Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkelman, who is up at Brown. But, I think it's a process issue, right? I think in this nation, somehow, some point, we decided every idea is a good idea, and we need to run processes so complete that everyone in the community is satisfied, forgetting that, the ultimate, endpoint is producing more housing or energy or whatever community asset we're talking about at the time.
If those things are true, how is that not getting greater attention?
Right. Why isn't
At
this
the
obvious?
state and federal level, that this is
Right.
a key issue if we want communities to thrive, which we do, because and if you want it for selfish reasons, to John's point, if you're slinging pizzas, you just want more people to buy pizza on Friday night. It could be that simple. I need people walking into my bakery, walking into my pizza shop, walking into my hardware store. So it can be macro for tech companies. It
Yeah.
can be very micro
Yeah.
for the guy on the corner who needs more families buying pizza on Friday night pizza night.
It has to do with your horizon of focus, right? When you're focused at that neighborhood level, sure, I want more customers. I want more, consumers of pizza slices, but they can live in the next town over and drive in, or we have a delivery service, And so I think that's part of it. And again, that speaks to the need to really elevate this conversation to a statewide or even a national discussion. I also think that recognition is growing. The number of folks who are talking about innovation in financing tools, right? I was just at the IMN conference in New York City, the Attainable Housing Summit, and I can't tell you the number of startup ADU developers that were there, networking, raising capital, so on and so forth, right? So some of these elements are coming into place. We have so much more work to do, and again, it's sort of like we need to have bolder solutions than we have tools on the table. But right now, we need to focus on those short-term wins, while at the same time inventing and innovating the longer-term solutions that are going to get to an ultimate solution at scale, which is a nation where every person, no matter background, has the opportunity to achieve that dream of a home, right? That's not something that's going to occur overnight. That's not something that we are equipped to effectuate right now today, but we can certainly take steps. I think the broader conversation, again, going to federal, right? We're in an environment where the president released a skinny budget that zeroes out a large number of federal housing investments. More structurally, we have seen federal investment decline in housing decade over decade. both under Republican and Democratic administrations, by the way. One of the barriers that we're dealing with is the political will. If this is the crisis of our generation, policymakers need to step up and treat it like a crisis. What do we do when we have a global pandemic killing many Americans across the country? We invest in very rapidly developing a vaccine and funding it. What do we do when we have international tensions, right? We invest in our military. The housing shortage and affordability crisis is that crisis of our generation. And we need the federal policymakers, we need state policymakers, we need local actors to step up and drive meaningful solutions. But that doesn't happen without political will. And that's really why we exist, again, to build that coalition and build that voice reflective of the public interest and agitate for that change.
There's a lot of ways that you could do that. I don't want to be a dick, Jeremy, but I'm going to maybe say a couple of things. Maybe it's just because the Tigers and the Guardians are tied in AL Central right now, and I'm kind of hoping we can take the lead a little bit. But Jeremy, like it's, you're claiming YIMBYism, and right now you've got your fingers crossed behind your back because you're in a hotel. So I don't know if you're saying yes in your existing backyard, your actual backyard. But in your actual backyard, you're in Detroit. I am a very, very proud YIMBY, yes, in Jeremy's backyard, because the backyard that really could use housing to drive economics is backyards like Detroit, right? Like when you say housing is a driver, is an economic engine, like when I look at cities that are experiencing huge housing crisis, like even take DC, like these are cities that have benefited from the agglomeration of really smart people working in one consistent industry. As much as like Austin becomes the place where software engineers that are good at AI are going to start wanting to move because that's where the companies are going to be and that's where the jobs are going to be. Austin is going to have a bunch of really highly paid software engineers that are going to continue crowding in that city. And you're never going to have poor people live there. You just won't. They're going to be delivery service providers. The firemen, everybody are going to have to live outside of Austin unless somebody redesigns Austin. I think that's just the thing. But like, where can people go? And I think the answer of this administration, Mike, back to your point on the federal level, is if we can invest in industries like manufacturing rather than these agglomerative effects of sort of the hyper educated class, maybe we could go to places where there are backyards that have plenty of space. And maybe it's not federal lands, but it's certainly Detroit, which has, a considerable more amount of infrastructure and housing than say a Washington, D.C. does for expansion. So that's just a long-winded way of kind of saying, yes, in Jeremy's backyard. I fully agree with Jeremy. Maybe not so much in my backyard, but it just makes more economic sense to be in Jeremy's backyard. But Mike, if you're advocating for federal solutions, one way of advocating for federal solutions is to open up the places in this country where we have a housing supply excess versus fighting against the places that have a deficiency where we're just trying to continually fight people like me who are continually trying to protect their, like, anyway, you see kind of what I'm saying? Like there's different ways the federal government could approach this. I'm curious to know, like, do you advocate for all of them? Do you advocate for some? Anyway, give me your sense of like, what should the federal government really do in light of what we're currently facing as a crisis?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And I fully agree that the way I would put it is we have two Americas. We have the America of the, what is it, that's called sometimes in investor circles, the sexy six cities, right? New York, San Francisco, Boston, maybe Seattle, LA, Chicago. That's where the majority of the GDP is produced across this country. That's where the majority of innovations and startups are getting off the ground. That's where the jobs are. And that's where you can go and make a lot of money. Except you can't, by the way, because of you, Jonathan, being an NIMBY and making sure small apartments can be built in your hood. But on a serious note, I mean, look, yes, we need to focus on those communities left behind. Like there's plenty of housing in Baltimore. There's lots of housing in St. Louis. Why aren't people there? Why isn't that the obvious solution, right? Like, well, where's the economic engine of that town, right? It's gone. It's moved to Chicago. And so I think that, again, sort of recognizing that there's this broader conversation. It's not just housing, right? Economic development is super critical. That's why we say there. But in terms of what can the administration, what can Congress do today, I think there's a few key elements, and I'll just call out two. One, there is a huge opportunity with publicly owned land. And I'm not just talking about federal publicly owned land. I'm talking about state and local as well. The Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, Center for Geospatial Solutions, released a report just about a year ago and found that there is development capacity on federal land to the tune of 2 million new homes. And that's not Bureau of Land Management or U.S. Forest Service land. That's federal land infill within 15 minutes of jobs and transit. And guess what? Federal government controls zoning on land owned by its agencies. Federal government can enter into ground lease deals and spur the construction of affordable housing in a way that private landowners can't. So there's a huge opportunity there, I think, to catalyze the housing we need. Again, not in the existing single detached neighborhoods like yours, but in places that are already fairly intense contexts where we can deliver loads of housing to satisfy immediate needs. But I agree with you that in the long run, we need a more balanced nation, right? We need to focus on closing that gap between the superstar cities and the communities left behind. And unfortunately, housing is only one part of that conversation. It's going to require a lot. But I do think that that's a key imperative if we're going to create truly broad-based affordability. So yes, it's a physical problem. There are so many people that can fit into your neighborhood. On the other hand, I want to lean in on this point, which is density is not some dystopian future where we're packing people in like sardines. And in fact, your home might have been a Sears kit home, right? It might have been built by, it may as well have been built by William Levitt and Sons. The idyllic American single family home that, Leave It to Beaver lived in is not some permanent institution. It was invented by, Madison Avenue about 100 years ago. Things will always continue to change. Our communities will continue to evolve. That's a big learning that I have from my urban studies program out in Portland. And so we need to both adapt our communities to welcome all neighbors, to ensure our communities, however big or small they are, continue to be productive. But we also need to open up the aperture and think about America's housing needs, not as myopically as just meeting those needs in the sexy six cities across the country.
So you said two things, Mike, and the first one I think you covered, which is using available land that is controlled by state or federal to build good stuff. What was the other sort of ask of Congress? Because I want to make sure I and our listeners and others know how to support your organization. I certainly, you hear about there's a Manhattan-sized land in the middle of Miami that's owned by the state or federal government that could be used for. Anyway, that's a huge opportunity. And I think that's an obvious and easy place to point to. And I think all of us should continue helping you advocate for that. But can you say what the second thing was?
Absolutely. Scale what's working, right? We have a very productive private activity bond system that is, for listeners who might not be familiar, bonds that fund things like big energy projects and affordable housing communities, tax-exempt bonds authorized by Congress. And that is one of the most effective programs to leverage private sector capital to deliver not just housing, but affordable housing in growing communities. We're working on a bill that would propose to eliminate that cap, open market for building affordable and mixed income homes if you're in a jurisdiction that has streamlined project permissions and has liberalized, lowercase l, the regulatory framework. And so, those are the kinds of solutions. Unfortunately, Jonathan, it's a bit of, we're not working on an issue where there's one neat trick. We're working on an issue where we're going to have a whole set of solutions run concurrently and that constitute a holistic solution. But again, back to the basics. It's about opening up land. It's about lowering the cost of capital. It's about expanding the workforce. And it's about bending that cost curve through smart and appropriate regulatory reform at the local level that's going to unlock an America where we can achieve housing abundance.
So I'll let Jeremy have the final question, but I just want to ask one more quick thing as we're kind of talking about what it is that the federal government can do, because you did mention something I thought you might, which we've heard, which is sort of the withholding of transportation dollars, the stick approach the federal government might have to force zoning changes at the local level. I've even proposed that since the government runs them, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, to some extent FHA, can just withhold mortgage liquidity from areas that don't adopt zoning changes that the federal government wants. Do you feel like those are too confrontational? Are those on your list of possible tools? Just curious to get your thoughts on it.
I think the lesson from California is that a stick approach complemented by a carrot approach is an effective approach. Having said that, Beverly Hills, California is the minority condition. There are lots and lots of jurisdictions that are quickly realizing that if they don't act, even these mayors, these city council members who have loud NIMBY constituencies are realizing that if they don't act proactively to address these challenges, then the state's simply going to take their power away. I actually think that the stick approach is better wielded at the state legislature level. I deeply believe the role of Congress and the federal government is to provide leadership and to lead America through a compelling vision of what could be, right? And that means partnering with and supporting local governments through programs like the Pro Housing Grant Program, through providing greater access to financial capacity for the production of homes, through smoothing the investment cycle, as we had talked about earlier, to sustain a consistent and continued building program. Look, we need a Marshall Plan for housing in this country. We're not going to solve the housing shortage in fits and starts. We're certainly not going to solve it project by project, and I think we're past that, but we're still at the whims of the cycle. And so I think that is the appropriate place for the federal government to lean in. And the good news is we're beginning to see that with the introduction, with the creation of the YIMBY caucus, the Bipartisan Housing Frameworks Act, Road to Housing, which has been Senator Tim Scott's policy initiative for several years now, is gaining traction. I think we're at the moment where we have that bipartisan consensus and a broad coalition of supporters that can really open up these opportunities.
Thank you. That's incredible. We like to end our show, Mike. It's a kind of put you on the spot question, but we promise it's meant to be fun. And you did mention innovation and you mentioned startups earlier. So we like to ask, you're a founder, you saw the need for a national organization and you created Up for Growth. If there was someone listening to this podcast who's also a wannabe founder, do you have an organization, an idea, a business that you would say, man, this should exist? I wish someone would start this business. So we like to ask that. What would you recommend, or what is something, the discrete problem or business that somebody could be starting that, obviously you don't have time for as the founder and CEO of Up for Growth, but does something pop to mind?
Data is really bad. Data is a consistent challenge. When we're trying to understand housing needs, I like to tell folks the story about the state of New York. The state of New York came to us when Governor Kathy Hochul was running initially the Housing Compact. And they literally said to me in the governor's office in Manhattan, they said, we have no idea how many units were permitted in Poughkeepsie. We have no idea how many units were built on Long Island. We just don't have the data. And it boggles my mind. I mean, you go onto census, you go into HUD data sets, and it is just so bare bones, incomplete. Margin of errors are huge. So I believe that we need more investment and more entrepreneurship in the data and data aggregation business. Real estate, of course, is just so opaque. It has for a very long time, and it's getting better, but it is not the level of transparency that you get with bonds or equities. From a policymaker's standpoint, it's a real impediment. And so just getting better data and connecting the dots between what Zillow might have and what Yardi might have and what CoStar or ULI might have, right? There is so much work to be done and so much opportunity to support investors, developers, folks across the housing ecosystem and make money doing it. If I were to launch a a startup for profit, that'd be a place I'd look.
That's such an awesome. I love that, Mike. Mike, thank you so much for what was a great conversation. Super insightful. Thanks for putting up with my NIMBYism and Jeremy's continual optimism. Really appreciate having you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Great. Well, that does it for today's episode. To our listeners, we'd love to hear from you. Please send us an email at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. And if you like what you hear, how about leave us a review, maybe?
And hit subscribe so that more of these episodes come into your feed when you share them, and let us know, as John said, what you think. Thank you, as always, to Keenan Chen for the music.